stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the manfromleng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am taking a look at 1,000 Shapes of Horror, the second Mythos pack in the Dream Eater cycle. Fantasy Flight Games recently unveiled this pack, which has the investigators searching a decrepit abandoned home in Arkham for a key so they can travel physically to the Dreamlands. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. The Arkham Horror LCG community is amazing, and these people have gone above and beyond to bring you content like these Mythos pack previews. If you'd like to become a patron and support the channel's goals and see your name in lights, follow the link down below, sign up for a tier, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. The Unnameable awaits, so let's get started. 1,000 Shapes of Horror is Scenario 2B of the Web of Dreams campaign, with Scenario 1B appearing in the Dream Eaters Deluxe expansion. Unless you've been living under a rock somewhere, you're probably well aware by now that the Web of Dreams is structured differently than previous campaigns. Half of the scenarios are set in the Dreamlands, while the other half are set in the waking world. Each half forms a 4-scenario mini-campaign. You may also combine all 8 scenarios to form a larger campaign, or of course you may play each in standalone mode if you wish. 1,000 Shapes of Horror opens with a team of investigators divided into 2 groups. Apparently the first group has become trapped in the Dreamlands, possibly as a result of a failed quest for the mythical city of Kadath in the first Mythos pack of the cycle, the Search for Kadath. The second group remains in Arkham, where it has discovered evidence to suggest the Dreamlands and the waking world are being pulled closer and closer together by some unseen force. I think it's safe to assume that that unseen force is Atlaknacha, the spider god who spins a great web that forms a bridge between the Dreamlands and the waking world. However, the investigators are unlikely to confront it until the final Mythos pack of the cycle, the aptly named Weaver of the Cosmos. FFG's preview article makes it clear that the stakes are high. If the worlds merge, a great calamity will befall both. It is once again up for Arkham's investigators to save the world. The group of investigators left behind in Arkham decide the best course of action is to force their way into the Dreamlands physically, but that will require a key which may be hidden in a haunted house. Renowned dreamer Randolph Carter refers to as the Unnameable. FFG's preview article says 1,000 Shapes of Horror is inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's short story The Unnameable, which was published in the July 1925 issue of Weird Tales. I think inspired is the right word here, because the Unnameable in Lovecraft's short story is not a house at all, but some type of monster raised in the attic of a dilapidated house on Meadow Hill in the town of Arkham. The protagonists of The Unnameable, a weird fiction author named Carter and his close friend Joel Manton, discuss the indescribable entity that allegedly haunts the house while hanging out in a nearby graveyard. Carter suggests the entity, a devil-like figure with horns and hooves, was born in the late 17th or early 18th century and kept hidden away in the attic. At some point, the entity died, rising as a creature that cannot be perceived by the 5 senses. The story concludes with Carter and Manton coming under attack by the entity. The pair awake in St. Mary's Hospital and bear the scars of a large horn-shaped object and bruises of hoof prints on their backs. While the nature of the injuries seems to confirm the creature's devil-like nature, Manton provides a very different description from which this Mythos pack draws its title. It was everywhere, a gelatin, a slime, a vapor, yet it had shapes, 1,000 shapes of horror beyond all memory. There were eyes and a blemish. It was the pit, the maelstrom, the ultimate abomination. Either way, investigators will encounter some type of creature that is impossible to quantify and accurately describe while searching the Unnameable for the key to enter the Dreamlands. If this creature cannot be perceived by the 5 senses, it may also be immune to traditional weapons. Investigators had better pack their spells and relics just in case. FFG's preview article doesn't provide many details about this scenario besides the fact that the investigators are entering the Unnameable to search for a key. Agenda 1A, the house with no name, has a doom threshold of 5. That won't give investigators much time to search the home before the unnameable entity makes its move against them. Act 1A, Searching the Unnameable, has the following objective: explore the house to find a way into the Dreamlands, find and complete an objective on another scenario card to advance. Now, we've seen this type of scenario design in the past, notably Act 3A, Campus Safety from Extracurricular Activity in the Dunwich Legacy Deluxe box. The preview article provides few hints about what the investigators are looking for besides a key, so I expect there will be a fair amount of trial and error required while trying to identify the right path to victory. FFG's preview article spoils 4 player cards that will appear in this Mythos pack. They are Otherworld Codex, Let God Sort Them Out, Ethereal Form, and Versatile. Let's take a look at those cards now. Otherworld Codex is a 3-cost Seeker asset that costs 2 experience points. It has Willpower and Intellect skill icons and the item and tome traits. It enters play with 3 secrets, and it has the following game text. Action: exhaust Otherworld Codex and spend 1 secret. Search the top 9 cards of the encounter deck and choose a non-elite card among them. Discard a copy of the chosen card from play. Shuffle all of the searched cards back into the encounter deck. The Otherworld Codex takes up a hand slot. There are plenty of ways to counter encounter cards as they are drawn during the Mythos phase, but relatively few ways to counter them after they've hit the table. The only cards that come to mind are Close Call 2, a survivor event from the core set that lets you shuffle an enemy back into the encounter deck after you evade it. Logical Reasoning 0 and 4, Seeker events from the Path to Carcosa cycle that let you discard an encounter card with the Terror trait from an investigator's threat area. Cheat Death 5, a rogue event from Dim Carcosa that lets you discard all cards from your threat area. And Dumb Luck, a survivor event from the Forgotten Age that lets you place an enemy on top of the encounter deck after you fail a skill test by 2 or less during an evasion attempt. Otherworld Codex is less restrictive than the cards I mentioned above. Besides taking an action and exhausting the card, you don't need to do anything fancy to trigger it and search the encounter deck. Otherworld Codex also has a wider array of potential targets. If you search the top 9 cards of the encounter deck and find another copy of an elite enemy, such as the Acolyte, you may discard that non-elite enemy regardless of its location on the table. The same is true if you choose a non-elite treachery, such as Frozen in Fear. If you find a copy of Frozen in Fear in the top 9 cards, you may choose it and discard a copy of Frozen in Fear in play, regardless of its location on the board. You don't need to be at the same location as the investigator who is engaged with the enemy or laboring under the effects of the treachery. That's a pretty cool effect. Otherworld Codex enters play with 3 secrets, so you might be able to pull off this trick 3 times more if you stack extra secrets on it with Enraptured and Truth from Fiction from the Boundary Beyond. While the ability to discard a non-elite encounter card is powerful, I can see a couple of problems with this card. First, it takes an action to play and an action to trigger. I'm not a big fan of cards that essentially require 2 actions to trigger, especially in solo play. Otherworld Codex does have the tome trait, however, so you can get around this problem by paying Daisy Walker and using her additional action to trigger the tome. Another option is to use Knowledge is Power, a Seeker event from Union and Disillusion that lets you resolve an action or free triggered ability on an asset on the table or in your hand, ignoring all costs. The Otherworld Codex certainly qualifies as a target, so you could trigger it a couple times per game without needing to actually bring it into play. You also have the option of discarding it from your hand and drawing a card if you wish. Another potential problem is that triggering the tome requires an action that will trigger an attack of opportunity if you are engaged with an enemy. If a Seeker or off-class Seeker gets cornered by a non-elite enemy, they could trigger the tome in the hope of discarding it, but they will take an attack of opportunity in the process. Now, taking an attack of opportunity isn't the worst thing in the world if you're certain the action that it is triggering the attack will deal with the problem. Unfortunately, that brings me to another issue with the Otherworld Codex, and that is the investigators are entirely at the mercy of the cards remaining in the encounter deck. Otherworld Codex lets you search the top 9 cards, almost a third of your average encounter deck, but discarding a card is far from guaranteed. For example, the Striking Fear encounter set from the core set contains only 2 copies of Frozen in Fear. while the Agents of Hastur encounter set contains only 2 copies of Screeching Byakhee. If both copies are already in play or one copy is in the encounter discard pile, no amount of searching the encounter deck is going to help you in this case. If you've got a copy of each in your threat area toward the beginning of a scenario, the odds of discarding one or the other is less than 50-50. If you hope to discard an Acolyte that's hunkered down at a location on the opposite side of the board, your odds of success will vary wildly depending on the number of cards in the encounter deck, the number of copies of Acolyte on the table, and the number of copies of Acolyte in the encounter discard pile. There are only 3 copies of Acolyte in the Dark Cult encounter set, so finding a copy in the encounter deck is not a sure thing. Otherworld Codex may be more reliable if there are plenty of targets on the table, say if you're playing one of the scenarios from the Circle Undone that dumps a metric ton of treacheries in your threat area. However, you'll never know what you find until you search, so using the Otherworld Codex in hope of discarding a specific non-elite enemy or treachery is somewhat problematic. It's been a while since I've done some math on this channel, so let's take a moment to dig a little deeper into the odds of discarding a card with the Otherworld Codex. Let's assume that we're playing the Devourer below from the core set. At the beginning of the scenario, there are 29 cards in the encounter deck. Let's say we draw Frozen in Fear during the first Mythos phase. Now, admittedly, Frozen in Fear isn't a great example since it's relatively easy to remove with a willpower skill test. However, it's standing in here for cards that are placed in an investigator's threat area. If we assume the other copy of Frozen in Fear is actually in the encounter deck, your odds of finding it in the top 9 cards are 32.14%. Your odds improve to 36% if there are 25 cards remaining in the deck and 45% if there are 20 cards remaining. Frankly, those odds aren't great. Most of the time you'll search the top 9 cards of the encounter deck and come up empty-handed. Your odds of finding that elusive Frozen in Fear jump to 60% if there are only 15 cards remaining in the encounter deck. It's worth noting here, though, that if you are playing solo and the average game lasts 12 turns, you are not going to get down to that 15-card threshold. Obviously, if there are fewer cards in the encounter deck, your odds of finding the card you want are greater. However, the more cards you draw from the encounter deck, the greater the odds the card that you want ends up on the table or in the encounter discard pile, rendering the whole exercise moot. And we haven't even discussed the impact of mechanics that reset or reshuffle the encounter deck, shuffle the encounter discard pile into the encounter deck, or discard cards from the top of the encounter deck. That makes it extremely difficult to determine exactly what the odds will be when you trigger your Otherworld Codex. Let's take a look at the Acolyte example. Again, assuming the other 2 copies of Acolyte are in the encounter deck, your odds of finding it in the top 9 cards of a 28-card deck are 45.24%. Your odds improve to 52.10 at 20 cards and 65.71% at 15. Obviously, your odds improve with each additional copy of the card in the deck, but the odds of finding what you're looking for still aren't that great, especially if you are playing solo and you are only digging so deep into the encounter deck. You're simply not going to draw enough cards to improve your odds that much. I think the biggest difference between Otherworld Codex and similar tutors, such as Prepared for the Worst, is specificity. When I play Prepared for the Worst, I get to search the top 9 cards of my draw deck for a weapon. Now, there are times I'm looking for a specific weapon, but most of the time any weapon will do. If I've built my deck properly, I should have plenty of weapons from which to choose. Otherworld Codex, on the other hand, searches the encounter deck for a copy of a specific card, which reduces the odds of success significantly. The more I think about Otherworld Codex, the more I'm starting to dislike it. I think my problem with the card boils down to the fact that you are searching for a very specific card, that being a copy of a non-elite enemy or treachery in play, and that card could be in any number of places, including the encounter deck discard pile, or on the table. Unless there are very few cards in the encounter deck, the odds that your search will whiff are surprisingly high. I'm also having a tough time deciding whether the Otherworld Codex is better in solo or multiplayer. If you're playing solo, there will likely be more cards in the encounter deck, so the odds of pulling 1 or 2 cards from a larger deck won't be that high. If you're playing multiplayer, you're going to draw through the encounter deck much faster. You should have a smaller deck to search, which should improve the odds of success. However, drawing through the encounter deck rapidly raises the odds that all of your potential targets will either be in play or in the encounter deck discard pile. Otherworld Codex also seems very scenario specific. Some scenarios feature a lot of non-elite enemies and litter your threat area with treacheries that you can't remove without taking an action. Others do not. Otherworld Codex's lousy odds, coupled with the tempo hit you take to get it down on the table, don't really inspire me to play this card. The second card spoil in the preview article is Let God Sort Them Out. It's a free rogue event with a combat skill icon and the tactic and fated traits. It has the game text, play only during one of your turns in which you defeated an enemy with a total of 6 or more health. Add Let God Sort Them Out to the victory display and immediately end your turn. When earning experience during the resolution of this scenario, you earn 1 additional experience. It would appear designer Matt Newman has learned from the mistake he made when he designed Delve Too Deep, the Mystic event released in the game's first Mythos pack, the Miskatonic Museum. Delve Too Deep seemed like a very dubious bargain to many players, myself included, when it was released. Players abhorred drawing additional encounter cards, so the idea of drawing an additional encounter card in exchange for an experience point sounded like a very bad idea indeed. Even to this day, if I'm playing solo, I'm still reluctant to play this card unless I'm absolutely certain I can deal with the consequences of drawing that extra encounter card. However, it didn't take long for the community to find a loophole if you play Delve Too Deep in multiplayer. Delve Too Deep requires each player to draw an encounter card, unless, of course, 3 of the 4 players have already resigned, in which case those players still get the victory point, even though they haven't risked anything. That may not seem too bad at first, but it can quickly become abusive during a campaign when you've got multiple mystics or off-class mystics playing multiple copies of Delve Too Deep at the end of a scenario when most of the players have already resigned. I've done it myself, and it's great fun, but it's certainly not in keeping with the spirit of the card. Let God Sort Them Out puts the kibosh on those sorts of antics right out of the gate. The card grants only 1 additional experience point, and only to the rogue or off-class rogue who played the card in the first place. The rest of the investigators at the table get nothing. Let God Sort Them Out also nips other potentially abusive behaviors in the bud. As an additional cost to play the card, you must immediately end your turn, which prevents you from playing that second copy of Let God Sort Them Out in your hand. Let God Sort Them Out is also a hell of a lot more difficult to trigger than Delve Too Deep. First, you've got to defeat enemies with a total of 6 or more health. Honestly, I can't think of the last time I defeated enemies with a total of 6 or more health in one turn while playing solo. You could probably do it if you killed a boss towards the end of a scenario. Unfortunately, killing a boss such as the Experiment or Silas Bishop usually triggers that objective that ends the scenario, and if the scenario ends immediately after the boss dies, you won't have a chance to play Let God Sort Them Out. Let God Sort Them Out seems slightly easier to trigger in multiplayer since enemies are more prevalent in that format. Then you realize that you've got to take an action to play Let God Sort Them Out after you've defeated all those enemies because the card does not have the fast keyword. Unless you're playing a rogue or off-class rogue who has some way of generating a bunch of additional actions, you've got to kill all of those enemies in 2 actions. That seems highly unlikely to me unless you're packing some serious heat, such as the Chicago Typewriter 4 from Lost in Time and Space, or the rogue version of the 45 Thompson 3 from For the Greater Good. And even then, the 45 Thompson 3 is far from a sure thing. An investigator may have the actions and weaponry required to trigger Let God Sort Them Out, but it's the Chaos Bag can still disrupt your best laid plans, especially if you need to kill multiple enemies to trigger it. Imagine killing a 3 health enemy, then pulling a tentacle and botching the second kill. Suddenly you're not going to kill 6 health worth of enemies this turn, and you've got to find yourself another enemy to reach that 6 health threshold. That is not very good. Let God Sort Them Out may prove to be easier to trigger during the Dream Eater cycle, which is expected to feature swarms of enemies. Still, it seems kind of odd to me that you need to spend a significant number of experience points to purchase the additional actions and weaponry required to kill all of these enemies, only to earn yourself 1 experience point. I don't think that's strictly the definition of a win more card, since experience points are usually always useful, but it seems awfully close to me. Cards that provide additional experience points tend to be quite good, but I'm not sure that's the case with Let God Sort Them Out. One of the problems I frequently run into while playing the Arkham Horror LCG is that experience points can be harder to come by in solo than multiplayer. That's not surprising considering a group of 4 investigators can cover more ground and kill more enemies than a solo player can in the same amount of time. I'd like a card that addresses that disparity somewhat, but Let God Sort Them Out is not that card. The odds of killing 6 health worth of enemies in solo is quite low, not to mention the fact that you need to spend anywhere from 6 to 10 experience points to purchase the weapons capable of doing it in the first place. I'm almost certain some player out there will build a deck containing the action advantage and weaponry required to trigger Let God Sort Them Out and put it to good use, but I don't think that player is going to be me. The third card spoiled in FFG's preview article is Ethereal Form. It's a 2-cost Mystic event with Willpower and Agility skill icons and the spell trait. It has the following game text: Evade. Add your Willpower skill value to your skill value for this evasion attempt. If you succeed, disengage from each other enemy engaged with you, and for the remainder of the round, you are ethereal. Enemies cannot be engaged or engaged with you, and you cannot attack or deal damage to enemies. Mystics and off-class mystics who need to evade an enemy have only 3 options at level 0. First, they can take up a straight-up evade action, though most of them have pretty average agility skill values. The second option is to play Blinding Light from the core set. Blinding Light 0 lets investigators evade with their willpower instead of their agility, which is good if you're a mystic. Unfortunately, if you pull a special token, you'll lose an action. That is not so good, and likely one of the reasons that Blinding Light 0 doesn't see much play these days. The third option is to play Mists of Rillier, an asset from the Forgotten Age. Mists is a great option since it allows an investigator to evade using their willpower skill value, and if you succeed, you get to move to a connecting location. Mists even comes with 4 charges, so you can rinse and repeat as necessary. Mists of Rillier forces you to discard a card from your hand if you pull a special token, but that is much, much easier than losing an action. Ethereal Form offers another take on the evade action. It has the spell trait, which synergizes nicely with cards such as Arcane Initiate, Diana Esperance, De Vermis Mysterious, Grounded, Marie Lambeau, and Uncage the Soul. When you play Ethereal Form, you add your willpower skill value to your agility skill value. For most mystics and off-class mystics, that means they're working with a 7 or 8, which should be sufficient in all but the most do-or-die situations. If you succeed, you exhaust the enemy you evaded and disengage from each other enemy engaged with you. Better yet, enemies cannot engage you for the remainder of the round, giving you a great opportunity to move through enemy-infested locations before you rematerialize. There are a couple of downsides to playing Ethereal Form. First, if you disengage with a bunch of enemies after a successful skill test, those enemies will simply re-engage with another investigator at that location. That doesn't matter in solo play, but it could be important in multiplayer. Ethereal Form won't get your entire group out of a jam, so keep that in mind. The second issue is that while enemies may not engage with you, you cannot deal damage to them either, so you can't play Ethereal Form to vanish and then follow it up with, say, Storm of Spirits 0 or 3. I don't think this is too big of a problem. If you're playing a card such as Ethereal Form, you're probably looking to extricate yourself from a sticky situation rather than immediately run back in spells blazing. Any mystic or off-class mystic may play Ethereal Form, but there are 2 investigators in particular who may like it: SEFINA Rousseau and Luke Robinson, the mystic investigator who will be released in the Dream Eaters. SEFINA likes Ethereal Form because it's an event and she can place it under her at the start of the game and replicate it with the Painted World. SEFINA also has a combined willpower and agility skill value of 8, making her a very slippery character indeed. Luke Robinson also takes a shine to events which he may play as if he were at a connecting location and engaged with each enemy at that location. Luke has a combined willpower and agility of 7, which is very good. He also has the advantage of targeting the enemy with the lowest evade value from the safety of a connecting location and then moving if necessary. For example, if Luke is flanked by enemies, he could evade the easiest enemy and then move in either direction. Don't forget that Luke can play Ethereal Form from the safety of his Dream Gate, which is connected to each other revealed location in play. Mystics and off-class mystics don't have that many good evasion options at level 0, so Ethereal Form is a welcome addition to the card pool. The ability to evade one enemy and disengage from all the others is fantastic if you get swarmed, which could be a very real threat during the Dream Eater's cycle with all those Zoogs about. Those enemies will go looking for other investigators to engage, but that's not going to be an issue if you're trapped in alone. And let's be honest, the group's guardian can't be in two places at once. Sometimes investigators need to take responsibility for their own safety, and ethereal form is a great get-out-of-jail-free card if you happen to get jumped by more enemies than you can handle. FFG spoiled one more card in the preview article, and man, it's a doozy. This is Versatile. It's a permanent neutral event that costs 2 experience points. It has the talent trait and the game text. You get +5 deck size. Your investigator's deck building options gain one other level 0 card from any class: Guardian, Seeker, Rogue, Mystic, or Survivor. Versatile has generated a lot of debate since it was spoiled by FFG. On the one hand, you have players who argue this card opens up Pandora's box. I mean, any investigator can add one level 0 card from any class to their deck. You can just imagine the limitless possibilities that go with that. On the other, you've got players who argue that this card is a trap that offers players very little in exchange for making their deck less predictable and more inconsistent. After giving it some thought, I tend to agree, I think, with the latter perspective. Since the dawn of collectible card games in the 1990s, there has been an unwritten rule when it comes to building quote-unquote competitive decks. They should contain as few cards as legally possible. In the case of a game such as Magic the Gathering, that means 40 or 60 cards in limited and constructed formats respectively. Now, while there's nothing stopping Magic players from playing more cards than the minimum required, doing so is generally frowned upon. The reason players stick to these limits is simple. If you want to win, you need to maximize the chances of drawing cards you need to draw. Decks that do this will be more predictable and perform more consistently than those that don't. The Arkham Horror LCG has different deck building restrictions than Magic, but I think you can make the same argument for your Investigator deck. If you want to quote-unquote win at the Arkham Horror LCG, you should play as few cards as legally possible to maximize the predictability of your draws and improve the overall consistency of the deck's performance. If you want a deck to investigate, fight, or evade consistently, then you really need to maximize the odds of drawing key cards that help you achieve those objectives. If you're not drawing those cards, you are probably in trouble. If you want a good example, check out my recent playthrough of Union and Disillusion with Diana Stanley for a textbook example of this in action. Diana is all about canceling cards, and I didn't draw a single cancel the entire game, and the scenario chewed me up and spat me out like day-old gum. Versatile lets you quote-unquote break the Arkham Horror LCG's deck building restrictions by adding 5 cards to your deck, including one level 0 card from any class. But you've got to ask yourself, is adding one card from any class worth the loss of predictability and consistency? I don't think that it is for the majority of investigators, because the odds of drawing that card consistency will be very low. Meanwhile, you've added 5 cards to your deck that will reduce the chances of drawing the cards that you need. I can't imagine how much trouble I would have been in if I had played Union and Disillusion with 5 additional cards in my deck. Unless all 5 cards of those played to Diana's strengths, that is, canceling cards, they would have done nothing but dilute the cancel cards already in the deck, exacerbating the draw issue that I was having. That said, there are maybe a few investigators who might benefit from Versatile. First up is a Guardian who has purchased Stick to the Plan from Black Star's Rise. Stick to the Plan lets you search your deck for up to 3 different events with the tactic or supply traits and attach them to it before you can draw your opening hand. You're still reducing the chance of drawing cards you need by adding those 5 additional cards to your deck, but attaching that level 0 card to Stick to the Plan eliminates any issue associated with drawing it consistently. For example, you could use an investigator like Mark Harrigan, who could buy Stick to the Plan and then purchase Versatile to pick up, say, Contraband to double the number of ammo or supply tokens on his assets. Seekers in general and Mandy Thompson in particular are another group of investigators who might find something to like in Versatile. Seekers have access to plenty of card draw and tutors which they can use to find the tools they need despite the larger deck size. Mandy's response and Elder Sign ability go one better, making those search tools even more efficient in her hands than a typical Seeker. Now, I'm not entirely sure which card Mandy would add to her deck, since her deck building restrictions enable her to increase her deck size to include cards from the Rogue, Mystic, and Survivor classes. That's pretty much all the cards in the game besides Guardian, so I'm not sure why she would increase her deck size by 5 to add 1 card from those classes, when she can increase her deck size by 10 and possibly include a whole lot more of them. Patrice Hathaway is another investigator who might benefit from Versatile. Patrice draws a new hand of 5 cards every turn, so she's likely to deck herself pretty quickly, regardless of whether her deck size is 42 or 47. Patrice is an off-class mystic, so she may be interested in supplementing her deck with powerful Seeker or Rogue cards. Now, there are a couple of other things worth mentioning about Versatile. First, it is non-unique, so you can purchase 2 copies to add 10 cards to your deck size and include 2 level 0 cards from any class to your deck. Again, I don't think this makes a whole lot of sense for most investigators, but Patrice Hathaway might like it. And second, when you purchase Versatile, you do get to add 5 cards to your deck for free. You do not have to pay additional experience points for them, because in order to have a legal deck, it must meet your deck size, so you get to add those cards without any further penalty. Versatile gives you the option to break the rules. Whether you take the bait depends a lot on your deck building philosophy. If you're willing to sacrifice some predictability and consistency in favor of having more options, then Versatile is the card for you. If, on the other hand, you value predictability and consistency above all else, then you probably want to look elsewhere, unless you're playing one of the investigators that I mentioned above. That's going to do it for my preview of 1,000 Shapes of Horror. Judging by the description of the scenario, investigators are in for a fight against the unnameable in the unnameable, which may be somewhat confusing for fans of Lovecraft's short story. The preview article did say the scenario is merely inspired by the short story, so I guess the confusion is forgivable. If the entity the investigators face in the house is anything like the one described in the unnameable, it could be very difficult indeed to take down. Investigators may need relic spells and some item that has not been revealed yet to prevail in that battle. As for the player cards, I'm not overly impressed by the ones spoiled in the article. I do like Ethereal Form because Mystics don't have that many events that can help them evade, but Otherworld Codex and Let God Sort Them Out seem very difficult to trigger with any sort of consistency. Otherworld Codex might be viable if there are a lot of potential targets in play, but your odds of discarding it to a specific target seem to be quite small, and there seem to be a lot of variables at play, so it's difficult to judge exactly what your odds are. Let God Sort Them Out gives the investigator a way to generate a bonus experience point, but there are a lot of hoops to jump through first. Defeating 6 health worth of enemies is going to be a challenge in multiplayer, and even more so in solo, unless you're swarmed, that is. Versatile is a difficult card to judge because it creates almost limitless deck possibilities. However, those possibilities come at a cost of predictability and consistency that competitive Arkham Horror LCG players may be unwilling to pay. We won't know for certain whether these cards will pan out until we get our hands on the Dream Eaters Deluxe expansion in a little more than a week, so I'm looking forward to comparing how I feel about these cards now with how I feel about them in a few months, once we've had a chance to play some of these scenarios and get a better sense of where the cycle is heading. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed this preview, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Remember to head over to Patreon and sign up to become a patron of the channel. That would be awesome. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.